It's been like a year since I've made a video at all. No, I'm not dead, I'm just extremely busy with college. I plan on making more videos, I'm still in the works of several of them, but for now this is pretty much all I can do. Anyways, it's that time of year again, so we're obviously going to be looking at a horror game. But this is one that, despite being one of the first and most well-known examples of 3D survival horror, I don't really see it get talked about that much. Yes, we all know how great of a game Resident Evil 4 is, or whatever, but that's more of an action game than a horror game. How many of you have played the original Resident Evil trilogy? They had these awkward tank controls, extremely limited to resources, and a lack of any sort of comfort or feeling of being safe. No, the first Silent Hill wasn't the one that started this, and no, the first Resident Evil wasn't the one that started this either, despite both being great games in my opinion. I see people thinking they did for whatever reason, but they didn't. Let's go all the way back to 1989 with someone named Frederick Raynal, a staff programmer at a French company called Infogrames. He was assigned to port one of the first non-wireframe 3D games called Alpha Waves to MS-DOS. Working on this inspired him to begin programming a tool for the creation and animation of 3D characters, with the help from... I'm sorry, I don't know how you pronounce that. Fast forward 2 years later to 1991, and Infogrames CEO, Bruno Bonnell, proposed a game to the staff where the players would use matches to gain snapshot views of an otherwise completely dark environment. Being a very big horror enthusiast, Frederick saw this as an opportunity to make a horror-based game in 3D, and was authorized to lead the project. Throughout the months, there were many basic sketches done, and they were used for an internal contest to pick the game's graphic artist. By this time, Raynal decided that the game would use text to convey the backstory, because he felt that computer graphics at the time weren't advanced enough on their own to be frightening. On top of that, he decided to focus more on the atmosphere surrounding the player, and this was pretty clear given the detail to the setting, a huge 1920s manor. Initially, he planned to make the game's background using scanned photos of an actual mansion from the 20s, but it was too complex for the type of tools that were available. So because of this, the team had to use hand-drawn backgrounds instead. The game had briefly acquired the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game license, but eventually denied it when it was determined that the game was way too simple to do justice to the rules of a pen and paper game. In order to give full potential to the horror aspect of the game and strike as much anxiety and fear into the player as possible, the game was designed so that doing almost anything will kill you instantly, which I will discuss later on. It was believed that these would make the player feel unnerved during these actions, which of course wasn't the case with everyone, but was correct in most cases. Originally there was going to be one player character, Edward Carnby, but they developed and added an playable female character, Emily Hartwood, and the reason for this was that at the time it was believed that a game would appeal more to a female audience if it had a female playable character. Going through working titles like In the Dark and Scream in the Dark, it was eventually released in the dark as Alone in the Dark in 1992. It was eventually finished up and released by the same company, Infogrames, as an MS-DOS exclusive and ported 2 years later to the 3DO system by Chrysalis Software. And man, this cover is just absolutely stunning. At least the DOS version, not the 3DO one over there. You have what seems to be the main character in front of this huge haunted mansion. The gates are wide open, it looks like there's a storm in the background, and you can see some souls or something flying up there. Just, ugh, I really can't get enough of this. And that's probably why I'll always feel the need to show it off to people. It's actually not that hard to find a boxed copy of the game since it sold over 2.5 million throughout its lifespan. It is quite a bit tougher to get an original complete working copy though. I've had mine for a while, but it was missing something pretty important. So my mom ended up getting me another one just a few months ago. Thanks, Mom. And I also need to give a really quick thank you to Dorian for giving me a really good deal on this game too. He's a director who I've had many decent conversations with, and he directed a really cool movie called Chicago Rot, so check it out if you want to see one that doesn't actually suck like a lot of the others these days. If you're watching this, I appreciate all of the help with everything over the last several months. Anyways, going back to the box and how much I drool over the cover, the back's actually pretty neat too, showing things like early screenshots and backstory, as well as some features like 3D graphics, camera angles, and spooks and shit. The early cover is this kind of sleeve thing with a two-piece box underneath. Inside of the box you get this registration card, the game on four 3.5-inch floppy disks, this neat fold-out manual, which looks like a rather cheaply made one, but is actually useful at times. This really cool newspaper type of thing that gives you some backstory on the game, some info on H.P. Lovecraft, and some other really cool stuff. And lastly, this copy protection booklet, which was actually the item I was missing. It can get extremely annoying needing to use this thing whenever you play the game, but I always thought it was really cool regardless. Some of my friends were asking me why I didn't just get a printout of it from someone else, and well, this isn't exactly something you could just shove in your scanner and copy without ripping it apart. But yeah, this is a really cool release and definitely worth seeking out. The book might be a pain in the ass to find for whatever reason, but it's actually a really cool and unique take on the whole copy protection stuff. That book and the newspaper were only on the first release of the game on floppies. There was another release with 5 5¼ inch floppies, and another just on CD-ROM, with the latter ones including something called Jack in the Dark, which was a freeware thing, but I'll get into that later. The European releases got their own separate cover too, and they're also beautiful. If you can find a copy of this, whether you like the game or not, it's a very cool release and it's a piece of gaming history, and it's definitely worthy of being a part of any gamer's collection. After installing the game and setting up your sound devices, you can launch the game to be greeted by the copy protection, which is what the book is specifically used for. As soon as you open the game, this screen pops up and asks you to match the objects with the page number. So inside of the book, you'll go to that page, find 2 shapes, and match the selected ones on screen with the ones on the book page. The book is tiny and has over 200 pages, so you had to have this book back in the day in order to play the game. It can get rather annoying doing this every single time you want to play, but it's genius copy protection if you ask me. Once you enter the code correctly, you'll be greeted by the simple but effective main menu, only with the options to start a new game, load a game, or quit to DOS, with other options being available later on in game. The backstory of the game depends on which character you pick, which was kinda special considering it came out in the early 90s. The male character is named Edward Carnby, who becomes the main protagonist of the series. He's sent to a supposedly haunted mansion named Derceto to acquire an antique piano left by the previous owner, who committed suicide and eventually gets stuck there. The female character you play as, Emily Hartwood, has a bit more of an interesting story. Her uncle lived in the mansion for quite some time, and he was the owner, and eventually he was found dead, apparently due to suicide. Emily thought this was really strange because knowing the kind of person he is, suicide would have probably been the last thing on his mind. So because of this, she decides to go to Derceto and see for herself what actually happened there. Aside from the backstory and gender, there's really no difference between picking either of the characters, at least from what I could tell. Upon starting the game, you can instantly tell how terrifying it is. Just look at this intro. Holy shit! Okay, on a more serious note, you can probably tell right away that the game isn't as scary as it was back then. Unless you're a total pansy or something. You can tell right away that the backgrounds were hand-drawn, like other early point-and-click adventure games. But these backgrounds actually look really nice and detailed. If you're wondering what video mode the game uses, it runs in MCGA with 320 by 200 res 256 color graphics. If you couldn't already tell, the character models themselves are laughably bad, at least today. Back then, they were rather revolutionary and were a major selling point of the time. Obviously, they still looked fake because they were in the very early, awkward start of 3D polygonal graphics. 3D games on the Nintendo 64 and in the early 2000s have aged rather well and look charming if you ask me. Stuff like this, on the other hand, has obviously lost its awe over time. It's not enough to break the game, and it might have some charm to it depending on who you are, but it's definitely nothing great looking at it in 2018. Those backgrounds, on the other hand, have aged really well. So for those backgrounds, the graphics gets a thumbs up for me. As far as the performance goes, I'm running this on DOSBox and it runs okay, I guess. I mean, half the time it'll be a silky smooth 60 frames per second, and other times it'll go all the way down in the 20s. I'm pretty sure this is due to emulation, because if you play this on an actual DOS machine, you can see right away that the frame rate is actually really consistent, and actually looks much smoother. So that's probably the best way you can play this game, but if you don't have an older PC, you're gonna have to bite the bullet and deal with the shitty emulation. As you probably already know, this game plays with tank controls. They're terrible and I absolutely hate them, but you can eventually get used to them after some time. This means that you use the up and down arrows to move forwards and back, and the left and right arrows to pivot the character in the specific direction. I think this was always intentional in these kind of games, since it makes you feel way more uncomfortable and adds to the feeling of never having any sense of security. Usually, you'd think to run forward in these games that you'd have to either press shift or double tap the forward key or something, but in here, for whatever reason, you have to be walking forward before stopping for a split second and then pressing the button again, so it's kinda tricky to execute. I'm able to pretty much do it at will, but it's pretty hard for me to explain how to do this right, so forgive me if I'm not making much sense. Your only other commands are the spacebar and the enter keys. Pressing enter opens up the inventory, and in it you can pick various items that you've acquired and use them in some sort of way, as well as dropping or throwing them. The bottom left box isn't that useful, but it shows a 3D model of whatever you're on. Aside from the items you find, you can also use the inventory to perform one of 4 actions: fighting, opening and searching, pushing, and closing, as well as a jumping option towards the very end of the game. Pressing and holding space performs these actions, but the combat is a bit stranger and something that needs to be explained a little better. If you have either a weapon or the fight action selected, you hold the spacebar down and press one of the directional keys to attack in that direction, if that makes sense. If this sounds clunky and awkward, that's because it really couldn't be any closer to it, only topped by that horrid running command. The combat is so unreliable and so goddamn slow that the enemies attack faster than you. If you get stuck in a corner while trying to fight an enemy and it hits you, you can consider yourself dead right then and there. Yeah, that's a pretty ridiculous death sequence. Get used to it though, cause you'll be dying a lot. Luckily, to make it easier for you, there's also ways you can avoid enemy attacks and prevent them from coming towards you. Like in the starting room, you're about to get ambushed by 2 enemies, a wolf dog thing that comes out of the window, and a zombie that comes out of the door on the floor. If this is your first time playing, you'll assume that you have to fight them and probably be scared and confused on what you have to do. But if you already have experience, you can push this wardrobe in front of the window to prevent the dog thing from coming through it, and you can push this chest over the floor to prevent the zombie from coming up. There's stuff like this all throughout the game, and you can probably avoid a good 60 to 70% of the enemies and traps, at least from my experience. You're probably wondering how people figured out how to do this back when YouTube and Google didn't exist, and actually you would know how to do this if you played as Emily. In her backstory, it mentioned her uncle doing both of these to protect himself, at least before he decided to kill himself. So there are some benefits to both characters, though I never finished as Emily, so I don't really know all of the differences. Regardless on who you play as, the gameplay is largely the same, so it won't really be a big deal on who you pick. In regards to the healing system, you can heal yourself by either eating food or opening these medical packs and drinking from a flask contained inside of them.
Ah. Ah.
But you have to be extremely careful and use them sparingly, because there's only 4 healing items in the entire game, and I'm not even exaggerating. Aside from those healing stuff, you'll also get various items like swords, keys to unlock doors, guns, books that you can actually read, and a bunch of other stuff. The inventory system itself is kind of weird. It doesn't actually go by how many items you have, but instead by how much weight you're carrying. You can drop items whenever you want and come back and get them later on because they don't respawn. So it's not that bad or that big of a deal. But once you get down to a certain point in the game, you cannot go back. So let this be a warning to everyone playing this game. I had to play this entire thing twice. I needed something to fight the final boss, and I'd forgotten to pick it up after freeing some inventory space. So I tried going back, and when I did, it respawned a creature that is both already supposed to be gone and impossible to kill. So if you get to this room, please make sure you pick up both this thing and this thing, and you should be okay. Just be really careful with this game, because starting a game like this from the start will probably make you want to punch a hole through your monitor, and I really don't know how I bothered to even have the patience to do everything over from scratch. Jesus Christ. Anyways, moving on to my absolute favorite thing about this game, the atmosphere. The atmosphere is what makes this game stand out even today from other survival horror games. Not very many of them, at least from what I've seen so far, are quite like this in the sense that it has a very strong Lovecraftian feel to it. Lovecraftian horror is, as most people define it, the fear of the unknown, which is very strong in this game. You already get a very eerie feeling entering this mansion that you know absolutely nothing about, but the second that you see that wolf thing attack you, though terribly dated, you feel tense and you don't really know what to do, and you get the feeling that something is always there watching you. Literally anything in this game can kill you, and it doesn't just have to be enemies. You walk through the mansion, the floor breaks. You walk more through the mansion, a heat-seeking axe will fly through the window and kill you. You read a book, it breaks your spine. Yeah, this game really doesn't mess around. You'll die extremely often, so you might want to save every few rooms. The controls are partially to blame from the deaths from the enemies though, but I'm sure that was expected from the developers. But yeah, as far as the atmosphere goes, it's pretty much perfect in my book. You never quite know what to expect going through any of the other rooms, but you know that you are not going to be safe. The sound also plays a pretty big part of this. The cries of the wolves in the distance always adds to the feeling that you're being constantly watched. I also love the sound of the doors slamming shut, even though they sounded nothing like an actual door. And there's also this weird sound that's like a clock or something. I really don't know what it is or what it's even supposed to be, but I guarantee that you won't expect it. It's all overall just really good stuff. Even the sound of your footsteps is great. Every step makes a sound and changes depending on the surface you're walking on or the speed of your moving or turning. The music is also nearly as important as the sound when it comes to the atmosphere. The music in this game specifically is something I don't hear get talked about very often, which is kinda sad because I actually really enjoy the music. If you play it from the floppies, it plays ad-lib music. If you play the CD version, then you'll hear CD audio that's really good and captures both the feel of the world and the atmosphere perfectly. Though I think I'd prefer the ad-lib version. It has more charm and personality, but maybe that's just me because I'm weird like that. If you're curious on how they sound, here's a comparison of the music from the first level in both versions. There's also voice acting. Yes, voice acting in a game from 1992. If you play the game on floppies, then you won't hear any of the voice acting aside from the character getting hit, or dying, or drinking whatever's inside the flask. But if you're playing the CD version, which is actually released a year later in 93, or in the GOG version, then you'll likely get fully spoken dialogue during the character introduction, which sounds terrible in my opinion. But this was one of the very first games to have voice acting at all, as far as I know, so you kinda gotta cut it some slack and consider how big of a deal this was for the time it came out. On the other hand, you'll also get fully spoken dialogue when reading books, which sounds far better to me, though it can kinda sound more like some guy talking in an audiobook or something, but I guess it works well considering it's being read in the voice of the writer. It's overall just good, eerie, genuine ambience that relies on your instinct, observation, and wits. Though sadly, you probably won't get very much playtime out of it, maybe 4 to 5 hours tops on the first playthrough. It took me around 2 to 3 hours the first time around, and the second time, knowing where everything was, it took me a little over an hour and a half, which is not very much at all. Right before the sequel, Alone in the Dark 2 was released, there was a freeware thing called Jack in the Dark, which was released on Christmas of '93 to promote the game. It took place on Halloween, but there were still Santa and Christmassy things there, so it really didn't make much sense. It was included in the re-release of the original game, more specifically on the CD-ROM version, as well as earlier copies of the second game. Some very early versions of the game came with the floppy versions of the first one. The CD versions had a large sticker over it, but these floppy versions are extremely rare, but are far cooler as they have this sort of gold wrapping with the floppy inside. I've personally never even seen one of these, and a handful of other guys I know that are huge longtime fans of the series all thought that this floppy was a myth, but apparently it's not. So you're probably gonna have to give one of your kidneys away for this one. But it was freeware, so if you want to keep one of your kidneys, you can just download it or something. As for Jack in the Dark itself, it has no combat at all and instead solely relies on some puzzles. This consists of things that you probably would have never guessed, but are extremely straightforward and to the point that it's almost embarrassing if you don't figure it out. Like needing to pour some oil to make a toy slip, getting out a drum set to lure some toys back into their chest, and using the candy and perfectly timing the use of this mirror to kill the Jack in the Box. I just spoiled the entire thing for you in like a minute, but whatever. It's still worth checking out if you want, but it's so short that you can literally finish the entire thing in 10 minutes. Maybe 20 in the first playthrough at the most. You can get this either by downloading or buying it like I just mentioned several times, but it also does come with the GOG version, which I'll discuss in a minute, and if you do have that version, you can choose to play it while opening the first game. Speaking of the first game, let's go back to that one because that's kind of what this video was really about. So for the big questions, does Alone in the Dark still hold up and is it worth playing today? To be completely honest, the game's aged really poorly. It looks terrible, it feels clunky, it's unnecessarily hard, it's confusing, and it's just a buggy mess. But despite all of this, it was still really fun to play through it, and it definitely has some charm that gives it its own personality, and I absolutely love it for that. I'm a total sucker for anything Lovecraftian, and the atmosphere in here is top notch, arguably even better than most other survival horror games at all. Despite how bad it looks, it's downright unsettling at times and it managed to keep me well at the edge of my seat, mostly due to, well, its Lovecraftian nature, the fear of the unknown. For a game this old that looks as bad as it does, it's really damn impressive that it still manages to pack its punch, and this is coming from someone who never gets creeped out by anything usually. No, it didn't terrify me or anything, but for a game this old to keep me at the edge of my seat like it did, is pretty impressive if you ask me. I'm telling you, atmosphere is such a huge part in anything horror, and it takes far more skill in my opinion to create an atmosphere that genuinely makes the viewer or player unnerved, rather than making some stupid cheap jump scares that have no real lasting effect. I don't know if I can wholeheartedly recommend this game to anyone aside from veteran horror fans. It's not something the average gamer would really enjoy and would probably get more annoyed than anything with how clunky and confusing it is. But it is a piece of history, so I say that it should at least be tried at some point in your miserable lives, and it's most and that it's most definitely worth checking out at the very least. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Go into it with an open mind. If you get stuck, take a break and hop back to it. Have fun with it, you know? Like I said earlier, if you're a collector, it's really not that hard to find a physical copy, and it's definitely worth seeking out. If you're lame like everyone else nowadays and just like getting digital stuff, you can go to GOG.com and get the entire trilogy for $6. It often goes on sale, so you can get it even cheaper if you wait for it. But however you can, grab it fellow horror fanatics.